Okay, boomers are becoming criminals and no one's talking about it. So apparently, old people are committing crimes. So let's see. I guess they're committing crimes now. I mean, I think that's a good thing. I think that's
People are
awesome.
getting really, really old lately. Life expectancy has been going steadily up for like decades, for centuries now, really. All of these old people are not necessarily living the lives that they thought that they would live at this point. We currently have a record number of over 50s
Yeah, I
in the
bet.
UK that are working. We have a situation where around 1 in 4 US adults over 50 says that they're never going to retire. But I want us to focus on a different place today, Japan. Japan is an incredibly interesting case study when you think of this phenomenon of elderly poverty and how this is driving a wave of crime amongst the elderly as well. There are a significant number of elderly people who are getting arrested and put in prison on purpose in order to avoid this combo of being broke and alone in old age. It's like a really interesting case study, even if you're not from there, because they actually have a lot of problems.
Japanese prisons were probably nice too. I ain't gonna lie. Especially if you're old, they probably do accommodations for old people and shit. Give them nice beds and shit. Good ass meals. I heard their schools have good meals, so I can imagine the prisons probably have really good meals too.
That are worldwide problems, but just dialed up to 11. Japan currently has the oldest population in the world by percentage. Almost 30% of the population is over the age of 65, and something like 1 in 10 are over the age of 80. If you're in a wealthier country, the aging population is almost certainly a problem. Similarly, they have an insane level of government debt. Japan's debt to GDP ratio is the second highest in the world, just behind Sudan.
Damn.
And I don't know how much you know about Sudan, but they're currently in the middle of a civil war, so they've kind of got a good reason to be down bad. Most countries are running just incredibly high levels of national debt, and it's eventually going to become a problem for a lot of places. But because it's not a problem now, we kind of ignore it. I don't know about you, but when I was younger, I had this idea of Japan as being like in the future. I think I just watched too much anime, and I had this idea that Japan was just living on another level to everywhere else. In a sense, I was right that Japan is living in the future. They're just living in the worst possible timeline of the future, despite the fact that their prison population has actually steadily been shrinking. The percentage of elderly inmates has actually been rising. The people who are left in jail are older and older and older.
Yeah.
The crime rate
This is bad, man. This is really bad.
amongst the elderly has actually quadrupled.
Like, who's gonna be the workforce to take all these jobs when these old people retire? Like, nobody? It's gonna be horrible.
In the last few decades. This isn't just a Japanese problem though, and in America you can see that people who are 55 or older made up around 3% of the US prison population in 1991, but 30 years later in 2021 they accounted for 15%. That's a 500% increase, right, in the elderly prison population. And it's resulting in this phenomenon where prisons are turning into de facto nursing homes, having to fulfill a societal need that isn't being fulfilled by the social care system. Some
fucked.
prisoners are now actually expected.
I mean, I guess if you're old and poor and you have no choice, yeah, why not commit a crime and be in basically an old folks' home? I mean, you can't leave, but you get to play board games and chess and checkers or whatever the fuck you want to play and watch TV. That's what old people want to do. And you get fed 3 times a day, a generally healthy meal, especially in Japan. American prisons, you get shit meals, but over there, they probably get generally healthy meals. So I can only imagine it's probably like the smartest choice for them. They're probably like, fuck it.
Part of their work duties to act as care workers.
And they're getting taken care of by the government.
And take care of other prisoners who are elderly and unable to take care of themselves. Japan is the canary in the coal mine. A really good preview of what might happen in a lot of different countries over the world. What makes this even more interesting is that Japan's criminal system has...
So they have old people taking care of old people in prison. That's actually fucking hilarious. Because there's no young people to take care of the old people.
99%
And if there are, they're playing video games all fucking night and day and not working.
conviction rate. And you would think that this would act as a severe deterrent, especially in the elderly, who typically commit fewer crimes than the rest of the population. Crime is one of those things that people usually age out of. But if we look at the specific crimes that the elderly are committing, you'll notice that shoplifting is an extremely common crime for the elderly, and it seems to be the crime that they choose to commit the most. If you commit shoplifting, you're basically guaranteed to go to prison, and if that's what you're looking for, if you're looking for a refuge,
up to
then
10
you can
years?
find it.
Damn. For shoplifting in Japan is crazy.
Bloomberg wrote a piece on this phenomenon of the elderly getting arrested on purpose. And they interviewed a number of elderly women who had chosen to check into to prisons. And this is what they had to say. So these are a few of the people that were interviewed. Mrs. A, who stole some clothing and was sentenced to 2 years and 3 months in jail. Mrs. T, age 80, who stole cod roe, some fish, and a frying pan and was sentenced to 2.5 years. And Mrs. N, who stole a paperback, some croquettes, and a hand fan and was sentenced to 3 years and 2 months in jail.
Crazy.
Granted, some of these people were like repeat offenders, but this definitely still looks like a disproportionate punishment for these crimes, right?
It is.
This first testimonial is from Mrs.
Severely
K, aged 74 years old. She stole Coca-Cola and orange juice. This was her 3rd term in prison. The sentence wasn't disclosed. And she has a son and a daughter. This is what she says about her choice to be in prison. I was living on welfare. It was hard. When I'm released, I will manage to live with 1,000 yen, $9 a day. I don't have anything to look forward to outside. This is a pretty on-the-nose testimonial about the experience of going to jail and why this woman at age 74 has decided to deliberately check into a prison effectively. I want to read a longer one next. When I was young, I didn't think about stealing. All I thought about was working hard. I worked at a rubber factory for 20 years and then as a care worker at a hospital. Money was always tight, but we still got to send our son to college.
You were a railroad worker and you still was broke? Where's the unions? Where's the pay? Where's the retirement fund? Where's the 401k? That's the union job right there. Come to America. We got you.
My husband had a stroke 6 years ago and has been bedridden ever since. He also has dementia and suffers from delusions and paranoia. It was a lot to take care of him physically and emotionally because of my old age, but I couldn't talk about my stress with anyone because I was ashamed. I was imprisoned for the first time when I was 70. When I shoplifted, I had money in my wallet. Then I thought about my life. I didn't want to go home, and I had nowhere else to go. Asking for help in prison was the only way. My life is much easier in prison. I can be myself and breathe, however temporarily. My son tells me I'm ill and should be hospitalized in a mental institution and take it easy. But I don't think I'm ill. I think my anxiety drove me to steal. This one is a particularly heartbreaking testimonial because it shows that this problem isn't purely being driven by financial incentives. Clearly, this is a person that lacked a social support network and the appropriate amount of support that they would need to be able to live out their last few years of life to a decent standard. That's kind of reinforced by this 3rd testimonial by Mrs. N. She's the one who stole a paperback, crickets, and a hand fan. She also had a husband, 2 sons, and 6 grandchildren. And she simply says that, I enjoy my life in prison more. There are always people around and I don't feel lonely here. When I got out the 2nd time, I promised that I wouldn't go back. But when I was out, I couldn't help feeling nostalgic. Yeah. Clearly, this crime wave is not just driven by money. It's also driven by a huge social component. The fact that she's clearly lacking a lot of what she needs in terms of community outside of jail, and that the prison system is not providing an easy way to transition outside of jail. And so people are just going through this revolving door. Even in their 70s, they have to go back. Particularly elderly women who are extremely likely to live in poverty. Nearly half of elderly women who are 65 or older who live alone are in poverty, and 29% for senior men.
Damn.
And it can be easy to think of boomers as being the ones who took everything from us. But poverty amongst old age is a huge problem, and it's clearly a huge driving factor for the people who choose to make this decision. One thing that did surprise me is that a lot of these elderly people who choose to go to prison have families. In fact, everyone who Bloomberg interviewed actually has family, whether it's a daughter or a son or a husband.
Are their kids not making enough money? I think that's what it is. I think they have their own bills to worry about, and I think it's really hard on them. I mean, granted, if my mama needed a place to stay and she owed, don't get me wrong, I'll make room. You know what I mean? I could sleep on the couch. She can have my bedroom. You know what I'm saying? I never let my mama or my dad, shit, they divorced, but they gonna have to live to learn under one roof if they have to. You know what I'm saying? When they owe, nigga, y'all have to figure it out. You know what I'm saying? But, all you need is a 4-bedroom house and pack all the family. You know what I'm saying? Live like the Mexicans do.
And yet we're lacking a broader sense of community, or felt that their family didn't necessarily provide the attention and care that they needed. Japan is a relatively collectivist culture, and there are more social expectations to gatherers families, but this is being eroded even there. Despite the fact that I said this is a Japanese problem, it's also a problem in a number of other countries. In the US, the problem manifests more amongst people who are homeless, who choose to go to jail and choose to keep reoffending in order to avoid the elements, avoid the cold of the winter, avoid danger and risk on the streets. Those who are even more desperate. There's a subsection of the population who has reached that like threshold point of desperation where going to prison is actually an upgrade to staying out on the streets. It just happens that Japan, given that they're so much further ahead with these problems, has expanded the group of desperate people to relatively normal pensioners. This is actually changing the structure of what prisons are actually doing in society. Japan tests for dementia when you get admitted to prison. It's exposing this huge gap in the social care system. When I first thought about this problem, I asked myself, how much does it cost to actually keep a person in prison? And it turns out that it costs 3.2 million yen in Japan to keep someone locked up for a year, according to the Justice Ministry. It's about double what a person on standard welfare can get, which to me is baffling. And you have to ask yourself, if they just gave the person that money, like straight up, would they still have committed those crimes? It surprises me so much that a country is willing to spend this much money to keep someone locked up like an elderly shoplifter, rather than strengthening the social security net in order for these people to not need to commit these crimes. The structure of crime itself has now changed to such a degree that elderly criminals are now more likely to reoffend than younger prisoners. And the Japanese government is trying to do something about this. They are launching initiatives between the justice sector and the welfare sector, and
probably just giving them probation instead of jail time for grave crimes. That'd probably be a first step, and maybe a reform, or like give them in housing programs. I know they have a housing problem there, but build skyscrapers with housing. Like, I don't know what the fuck you gotta do. Like studio apartments for old people and house them in that bitch. You know what I'm saying? Minimum cost. That's all old people need, is a studio. You know, 1 bedroom, 1 bath or something.
Treatment. But all of these measures are at the entry point and at the exit point of the prison system. While actually in prison, people aren't being set up to succeed, and they're simply getting a little bit of support at the start and end. Then it's not really a surprise that they choose to reoffend, and they choose to return to the place of comfort that they've learned. I genuinely don't understand why these parts of the social security net aren't being reinforced, especially in a place like Japan.
I mean,
I found this interesting.
It's definitely a money issue, money problem for the economy.
Survey with Japanese doctors, and they found that 30% of university hospital physicians are at risk of death from working too many hours. They also have a word for this. The solution seems somewhat obvious, and yet there are cultural and political barriers to getting it fixed. The conditions in Japan's prisons aren't great. Solitary confinement is a commonly used strategy, and the life in prison isn't necessarily good. It's just better than what people are living on the outside. I read this paper called Aging, Institutional Thoughtlessness and Normalization in Japan's Prisons. They talk about maybe some reform strategies that we could consider. And I think these are appropriate even outside of Japan, particularly this idea of normalization, which is to make the prison system as similar to the outside world as possible, so that people experience the least amount of shock when they transition between the two. One of the ways to make it a place for rehabilitation is to have rules that would reflect the rules that you're expected to obey as a common citizen. However, this is a challenging thing for a lot of people, because a lot of people do have an idea that prison is not necessarily a transitionary phase. I try to end on an optimistic note where I can, but this is a hard one to end optimistically on. What I will say is that social security nets are things that are not preserved by chance, right? They're preserved because people stand up for them. Yeah. And the easiest way to stand up is to vote, right? It's at least the one thing that you can do. It's worth investigating these things when you're voting in local elections. What is your local representative doing to build community in your area? What are they doing about social care and elderly welfare in your area? It can be easy to think of boomers as people with privilege or people with everything that we want or we need as a younger generation, but a lot are in the same boat as you are, of just trying to get through the next day, the next week, or the next month.
Hey, this guy's a good guy. For real. Only 128,000 subscribers? Yeah, bro. I'm gonna like and subscribe to this guy. He's pretty good.